So we next turn to the Iranian Revolution, which took place in 1979. But to really understand what brought that about, we need to go back a good deal further. In large measure, many of the factors that brought about the Iranian Revolution can be associated with the rule of the Pahlavi dynasty, beginning with Reza Khan, but more importantly, his son Mohammad Reza, who a lot of these developments actually really not getting underway until after the Second World War, by which point, by the way, Iran had become uh, viewed as an important ally by the United States in the Cold War, given its location next to the Soviet Union. And that's like a very important factor in understanding developments as well. But under Mohammad Reza, there will be an attempt to very rapidly westernize and modernize the country. And you might recall from the reading that you were assigned um, from Bill and Springborg, where they talk about different kinds of regimes. They use Iran as an example of a modernizing regime. And I suppose after 79, it could be an example of a revolutionary one. But in any event, for Mohammad Reza, modernization meant primarily westernization. So his vision of reform was very much a secular one and very much imitative of the West. But instead of Europe, increasingly the United States is starting to represent the West at this point. So in terms of this kind of program of reform, he actually came up with a kind of comprehensive approach known as the White Revolution, whereby he sought to modernize the country through very drastic measures, right? It's kind of what in economics they sometimes refer to as shock therapy, right? The idea that, in the long run it's better to just kind of rapidly transform the country. And usually that means a lot of pain in the beginning, but then eventually, the benefits start to accrue. Um, and, rather than kind of long drawn out kind of transformation where, maybe it takes a very long time to get to where you want to be, you can just do it very rapidly. And Iran is actually positioned to do that in large part because it does have extensive oil revenues at its disposal. Um, so, on paper, a lot of the different kinds of reforms connected with the White Revolution, uh, you know, would seem beneficial to the people, involving kind of land redistribution. Initially, at this point, Iran is a predominantly rural country. Vast majority of Iranians living in villages. But a lot of the reforms also, trying to kind of industrialize the country. So seeing a lot of kind of dislocation, villagers moving to the cities. The idea that they should, within a short period of time, find employment. Uh, but at the end, a lot of these reforms just don't work out the way they were intended. And there's a number of factors for this. One very important factor, to be quite frank, was simply that the Shah, Mohammad Reza, was very often out of touch with what was going on the ground. So he didn't really follow up to make sure that reforms were being implemented the way they should, and we start to see a lot of corruption. It becomes more about who you know than whether a program is properly implemented. So some people becoming very wealthy, but the vast majority of Iranians not benefiting from this. Some of it just kind of overly bureaucratic. You start to see other problems like inflation that weren't anticipated, but there doesn't seem really much of a plan for how to deal with that. So as you might imagine, given that most people aren't benefiting from these reforms, they ultimately prove very unpopular. And making matters worse, the kind of secular aspect to these reforms, in terms of educational reforms, the kind of curriculum that's being promoted and so forth, put off a lot of people as well. So Mohammad Reza really tries to kind of minimize the role of Shiism with respect to Iranian identity. But for many Iranians, particularly, if you're kind of a villager who's not particularly well educated, this is a very important aspect of who you are and how you identify as an Iranian. And as you might imagine, this kind of secular aspect of the White Revolution is going to be firmly opposed by the Shia ulama, who Mohammad Reza will try to, really actively suppress them, very often through arrests, intimidation, torture, and even the threat of death. Um, the problem with that, first of all, there's quite a few of them, but they are also a very kind of highly respected element within Iranian society. In many neighborhoods and many villages, the local member of the ulama or members would be, people that you looked up to for guidance and so forth. So going after them is really going to put off a lot of Iranians as well. So the Shah, on the one hand, is going to try and undermine elements within Iranian society that he feels might oppose him. We already talked a bit about the ulama. The other important group is the bazaar merchants. So these are kind of the old school, kind of economic elite going back, well, centuries, right? So we're not talking about kind of newly created uh, businesses on a Western model, right? But kind of more traditional enterprises, very often centered in these large markets known as bazaars, and both elements within Iranian society highly respected. Individuals who usually have a lot of political influence within their communities and so forth, and who tend to oppose the reforms that the Shah is trying to implement with the White Revolution. So, with respect to the bazaar merchants, he's going to initiate a large-scale anti-profiteering campaign against them, claiming, that this is about anti-corruption, weeding out corruption among the bazaar merchants. But really, it's about going after anyone who might be a threat to his power, right? So these individuals very often identified as enemies of the state. With respect to the ulama, he's going to try and impose a kind of regulated examination system so that if you want to become a member of the ulama or a cleric, you're going to have to go through this program. The idea that in this way you can kind of control which individuals actually end up constituting the ulama. In the meantime, also trying to limit the role of Islam in daily life. And at the end of the day, in neither case is this really going to work, right? This is just going to alienate these two very important, influential groups and put off most Iranians. And the problem is, if you're going to do that, you need to find one social group or create one that has a stake in your success, right? That wants you to succeed. This might be one of the big differences between modernization in Iran and what happened in Turkey. As per the reading that you were assigned, Ataturk is going to prove much more successful in large measure because he ensures that one social group benefits from the reform, the kind of upper middle class land-owning elite who end up also constituting the political elite. But you don't have any element like that either existing or being created within Iran, right? There will be kind of the development of a small middle class, but not nearly big enough. And then when inflation hits, many of those individuals will take a hit, right? So, there's also an attempt to create a kind of single party that would ensure loyalty to the regime, the Restachiz or Resurgence Party. But this ends up not really gaining any measure of trust among the people who see it as simply, kind of means for the Shah to promote propaganda. What this means is that eventually the Shah becomes more dependent on simply repressing opponents, inasmuch as there really isn't anyone who's supporting him. Very important in that regard is going to be the SAVAK. It's an acronym for, in English, Organization for Intelligence and National Security, and they end up becoming one of the most notorious secret services in the world, actually, right? So it was founded in 1957 with the assistance, by the way, of the U.S. Central Intelligence Agency, or CIA. So we see here kind of a early example of this kind of growing tie between the Shah, his repressive regime, and the United States. And this is really important for understanding Iranian attitudes towards the U.S. much later and even up until today. The purpose of the SAVAK was really just to maintain internal security, right? To put opponents of the Shah's regime under surveillance and then kind of actively repress any dissident movement, whether through intimidation, exile, imprisonment, assassination, and torture. And likely they were responsible for thousands of deaths. I mean, they really just had one of the most horrible human rights records during this period. And as you might imagine, right, I mean, the combination of all the different things that are going on are going to create a lot of opponents to the regime. And eventually they're going to find a kind of leading voice, someone who's going to pull together all these different strands of opposition to create a kind of unified movement in opposition to the Shah. And that individual is the Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. He is from the city of Qum. So first of all, I should note the term Ayatollah signifies one of the highest ranking members of the Shia ulama. And there could be more than one, right? But he is a very highly respected individual, but also very charismatic. Unlike the Shah, it might be noted. Mohammad Reza really not particularly charismatic at all, and that doesn't help his case either. But in any event, Khomeini obviously a very respected figure because of his religious credentials, but he also really knows how to speak the language of social justice, and even appealing to more secular-minded Iranians in that regard. And so he becomes one of the Shah's fiercest critics. He's eventually exiled by the Shah, first to Iraq, later he'll be in Paris. But in some ways, this actually frees him up to become even more critical. So he's going to end up recording a lot of speeches where he's kind of condemning the Shah and criticizing him, really kind of addressing all the kind of social and economic issues confronting Iranians. And many of these speeches end up being recorded on tape and then smuggled into Iran. And of course, he's not in the country, so there isn't much the Shah can do about it. And here we can see the city of Qum, Qum where it came from, which was a very important theological center, center of learning in Shiism. When he is sent into exile in Iraq, he ends up in Najaf, and that's where he actually spends most of his exile. And it too is a very important city within Shiism, a kind of very important center of Islamic learning. So the Ayatollah Khomeini was not only a fierce critic of the Shah, he was also proposing a revolutionary form of government that he felt would be suitable for Iran. Something that was best summarized in a series of lectures that ended up being kind of collected into a booklet, the title of which is Vilayat-e-Fiqh, Hukumat Islami, Government of the Islamic Jurists, where Khomeini outlined his theory of Islamic government. Based on this also, he deemed the Shah illegal. Rule could only be under an Allah-inspired fiqh, a competent jurisconsult, or a group of 3 or 5 of them. So in other words, whatever form of government you came up with, there would have to be some measure of oversight headed up by members, high-ranking members of the ulama. Likely to his mind, including himself, but there might be more than one individual involved. And again, this was actually a collection of lectures given by Khomeini that were then collected into this booklet, which was published in 1971 and then spread like wildfire across Iran. Right? So this also became a kind of another way of promoting opposition to the Shah. And we should know, if we're talking about opposition, this is where Shiism actually becomes really important. And you might remember that when we first learned about the schism between Sunnism and Shiism, we talked about this one particular event, the Battle of Karbala, when the grandson of Muhammad, who was prepared to rise up against the tyranny of the Umayyad Caliphate, had been forsaken by his supporters. Right, so it ended up being, basically a massacre where he and his 70 immediate followers had been slaughtered by the Umayyad army in Karbala. And this became an event commemorated within Shiism every year during the month of Muharram, where, among other things, they very often reenact the actual battle. Here we see a scene from such a reenactment of the horse returning empty from the Battle of Karbala. And you have other practices associated with this commemoration, including self-flagellation, where people might be whipping themselves and so forth. That tends to get a bit exaggerated in the Western media. But it's obviously not a joyous occasion, right? It's not a day of celebration. And what's really important is never portrayed as something that happened in the past, right? they never speak with regret that his followers back then didn't come to his aid, right? You might remember there was supposedly a large number of supporters in the city of Kufa who basically, when everything hit the fan, just disappeared into the woodwork. But they never talk about, oh, those guys failed to show up. They always say that we failed to show up in his hour of need. And we, as Shiites, should be prepared to stand up against tyranny and injustice, even if it means becoming a martyr to the cause, right? And this will become a very important factor leading up to the Iranian Revolution, right? What we failed to do in Hussein's hour of need against the Umayyads, we should be prepared to do now against the tyranny of the Shah, right? And by the way, this isn't the first time that we're going to see a kind of revolutionary movement or revolutionary activity in Iran. You have kind of a template for what's coming dating back to 1891, the tobacco protests. And so what brought that about? And you might remember the first kind of reforming Shah in Iran had been Shah Nasr al-Din. And in large measure, in order to raise revenue for the kind of reforms he wanted to initiate, in 1890 he had granted a tobacco concession to a British company, whereby the British company would have exclusive rights to produce, sell, and export all of Iran's tobacco crop in exchange for a loan, right? And tobacco at this point, right, this is well before oil becomes an important commodity. Tobacco was probably one of the most important commodities being produced in Iran at the time. Right? It's a very thriving industry. Many people depended on it for employment. And so, imagine you had about 200,000 people who worked in the tobacco industry who felt very much threatened by this development. And this led to mass protests against the concessions. And many of these were organized, by the way, by the Shia ulama. So we also see that they were playing an important role in kind of organizing revolutionary activity. In this case, they had issued a fatwa or a ruling against the use of tobacco, right? So, basically it was kind of a boycott of tobacco. That was part of the response, in addition to the, mass demonstrations and things of that nature. And the bazaar merchants were also very actively participating in this. They shut down the main bazaars throughout the country. So the combination, right, this kind of combined effort of the bazaar merchants and the Shia ulama eventually forced the Shah to repeal the concession. And so perhaps it's not too surprising that coming up on the Iranian Revolution of 1979, among the three major social groups that are going to be active at the forefront of this revolution, two of them are, again, the bazaar merchants, the traditional merchant elite, and the ulama, in this case represented primarily by young members of the ulama, in many cases even theological students. Right, so people on their way to becoming members of the ulama. The third group will be the urban middle class, right? Professionals, technocrats, students. So there is kind of a small middle class that results from the White Revolution, but they don't really feel beholden to it or to the Shah, particularly when they're confronted with growing levels of corruption and then inflation sets in, many of them losing a lot of their savings and things like that, people becoming unemployed. But many of them also educated in kind of Western ideas about democracy. And so that is going to be part of the agenda of the revolution as well, right? And we're going to see you have these kind of two different strands that are emerging. On the one hand, this one strand rooted in the idea that Islam should play a much bigger role in Iran's political future, but this other strand reflective of ideas about representative democracy, tended to be much more secular. And initially, there really isn't perceived to be some kind of conflict between these two different strands. And in fact, Iran had actually been on the path to becoming a democracy. Um, so early on in the Shah's career, it wasn't quite clear what would be the extent of his authority. It did seem that something resembling a constitutional monarchy was beginning to evolve. You had a parliament, you had democratically held elections, and then in one case, the fellow elected Mohammad Mossadegh, and this was right at the beginning of the 1950s, actually wielded a fair amount of power and had actually planned to nationalize the oil industry in Iran in order to provide revenue for reforms that he felt would be beneficial to the people. Um, so the Shah wasn't too happy about this, but at that point it wasn't clear he could do anything about it. Mohammad Mossadegh was extremely popular, among other things. But also unhappy was the United States. From their point of view, right, it's a little bit like what happened with Nasser and the nationalization of the Suez Canal, right? This was perceived as a kind of socialistic kind of policy. Obviously it threatened the oil resources and Iran becoming a very important source of oil for the United States. But particularly in the context of the Cold War, right? This kind of feeling that Mossadegh is pursuing socialist policies, and it wasn't just that, other kind of economic policies that would see the government play a much greater role. And this just kind of felt like Iran was drifting into the Soviet camp. And so at some point, the CIA became involved in helping to orchestrate a coup to have him overthrown. And the coup did succeed. So a number of things, right? There's still a lot of debate among historians about how important the CIA was in that regard, whether it would have happened anyway. But the second point is it doesn't really matter. From the point of view of Iranians, it was pretty clear where the United States stood in that regard, right? That they were prepared to undermine a properly democratically elected government in order to ensure that their interests were served. And from that point forward, the United States is going to do everything it can to prop up the Shah, who will become increasingly dictatorial. And so you're going to see kind of growing opposition. Some of this is, again, much more secular based. For instance, a very important figure that emerges, kind of in the leadership of opposition is Mehdi Bazargan, who was educated in Paris. So following the fall of Mossadegh, he co-founded with him the Freedom Movement of Iran, a moderate liberal Islamic group. So Islam's still playing kind of a role, but primarily promoting kind of secular democratic reform. Another important opposition figure emerging in this period is going to be Shapur Bakhtiar, also educated in Paris in political science, who served as deputy minister of labor in Mossadegh's government. And he's going to form another oppositional group called the National Front, which is even more secular, right? It's almost entirely about promoting kind of secular democratic reform. So these are both groups are you'll find members of the urban middle class gravitating to these groups, but also sometimes you have members of the ulama and the bazaar merchants who support these kinds of reforms. One really important figure we should mention, and more from a kind of intellectual perspective, is Ali Shariati, who was also educated in Paris. You start to see a pattern emerging here. And so he was a staunch opponent of the Shah's rule. Probably the most important thing he did is he really found a way to kind of tie together these two strands. Like on the one hand, kind of Shiism as a basis for political activism, right? That, Shiism somehow encourages people to become politically active, to stand up against tyranny and so forth. But also kind of connecting that to the kind of democratic reforms more secular-minded opposition is promoting. And so in that regard, he actually proved to be a very dangerous figure. And so it's probably not surprising that he ends up dying in London, most likely at the hands of Savak, right? He was really perceived as somebody who could kind of pull together all these different strands of opposition into kind of a unified opposition. I love this quote here from the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. And that gives you kind of an idea about, the manner in which he promoted Shiism, kind of appropriating it as a basis for kind of revolutionary change. Very often, in essence, almost of a more Marxist variety, right? So Sartre very famously once said, "If I have no religion," I mean, he was atheistic, but if I were to choose one, it would be that of Shariati's. So, what we see going on here is between the 1950s coming up into the 1970s, on the one hand, the Shah becoming much more dictatorial, much more dependent on simply repressing, often very violently, any opposition to his rule. And on the other hand, kind of growing opposition to his rule. uh, some of it becoming well organized. So that's kind of the backdrop against when things start really rapidly escalating towards revolution. A good starting point might be in early 1978. So what happened then? An official article attacked Khomeini, and this was it appeared in one of Tehran's leading newspapers, and this led to a sit-in demonstration by religious students in Qom, which, things like that had happened before. But in this case, a significant number of them were killed when the police moved in to break it up. And from that point onward, riots will break out every 40 days in connection with memorial services held commemorating those killed during the previous demonstration. So you have this tradition in Shia Islam that 40 days after the death of someone, people who knew that person, family members, friends, and so forth, would come together to kind of honor that individual, right? So that's going to start, that's going to happen in connection with these killings, but they very quickly evolve into new political demonstrations that the police then move in to kill people or end up killing people. And then 40 days later, you have again these memorial services that again, you can kind of see what's going on here, right? You're going to have this kind of snowball effect where every 40 days the number and the size of these demonstrations are going to grow. And then against that backdrop, at some point a fire breaks out in a cinema in Abadan, and whether it's true or not, a rumor spreads very quickly that the Savak were to blame. This happens in August of 1978. So a large number of people died in that fire, and then you have again 40 days later these kind of memorial services that very quickly evolve into political demonstrations. Probably the turning point is what's known as Black Friday, which takes place on September 8th, 1978, when troops opened fire on a really large mass demonstration in Tehran's Jaleh Square, resulting in hundreds of deaths. Right? So imagine that now, 40 days after that, you're going to see massive demonstrations breaking out throughout the country. People are utterly outraged by this. Here you see the victims of Black Friday, just bodies being lined up, just alongside a wall. And that's going to lead to massive protests. And then we're going to hit the month of Muharram, right? The month during which Shiite Muslims commemorate and remember what had happened at the Battle of Karbala, right? So kind of a perfect storm where, now the size of the protests are just immense. In spite of the fact that martial law has been declared, right? So these demonstrations have been declared illegal. In the meantime, the Ayatollah is calling for strikes from outside the country, which effectively sees the entire oil industry shut down. And at this point, many soldiers are just simply refusing to fire on the demonstrators. In fact, many of them are actually going to join them. That's a pretty good indication that it's pretty much game over for the Shah at that point. The only thing he still has going for him is support in the United States, but even that is becoming a problem. The president at that time is Jimmy Carter. He has made human rights a centerpiece of his foreign policy, so it's becoming very difficult for the United States to continue supporting the Shah. He's actually trying to put pressure on him to back off, to somehow try to negotiate some kind of settlement with these demonstrators. But it's really a case of too little, too late. And you can see that even many Americans were pretty much disgusted with our support of the Shah. You actually had large anti-Shah demonstrations in the U.S. taking place. So the Shah will make one last desperate gamble. At the end of 1978, he appoints one of the opposition leaders, Shapor Bakhtiar, as prime minister, even demonstrating a willingness to confer power upon the parliament and so forth. But this really is, very much a case of too little, way too late. In fact, the only real outcome of this is Bakhtiar is thrown out of the National Front. The fact that he was even willing to cooperate with the Shah. Finally, the Shah flees the country in January of 1979, and almost immediately after that, Khomeini will return. At that point, Bakhtiar just steps down. I mean, there's no point for him to remain in power. And it's pretty clear that from this point forward, Khomeini will be running the show. So the first thing he does, and we see him returning here on February 1st, 1979. At that point, he had been in exile in Paris, so he's coming from there. The first thing he does is replaces Bakhtiar with Bazargan, and then establishes a revolutionary Islamic council that will kind of work out, will kind of create a transitionary government while they work out a new constitution, a new basis for government, right? And so that transitional government is the Provisional Revolutionary Government or interim government of Iran. And it's pretty clear that Khomeini is the leading figure, though he hasn't really consolidated his control of the revolution just yet. Well, we have Bazargan appointed as prime minister of this provisional revolutionary government. On February 14th, he introduces a 7-member cabinet, mostly made up of secular moderates. So in theory, the parliament now should be the main governing body, but he finds it impossible to implement any of his policies because basically Khomeini keeps vetoing them. I mean, Khomeini has no official position at this point, but you really can't do anything that he doesn't approve of. And so finally, Bazargan is going to resign in November of 1979, simply out of frustration. In the meantime, Khomeini is consolidating his authority. The Council of the Islamic Republic is becoming the most important governing body during this kind of interim period, composed mainly of members of the ulama, but under the guidance of the Ayatollah Khomeini. And they're the place that ultimately holds real power during this period. And so it very often seems that even though Bazargan was effectively appointed by Khomeini, it very often feels that Khomeini is doing everything to undermine his government, basically threatening to veto any policy with which he disagrees. At the same time, this council begins to issue its own laws and decrees, which, given that this body initially didn't have any official standing, is kind of odd. But Khomeini is definitely the leading figure. People are looking to him for leadership. And so these laws and decrees will go into effect. And there are a number of other organizations that Khomeini is creating that are going to further consolidate his leadership of the revolution. Probably most important, and even until today I should say, the Revolutionary Guards, which is kind of an armed force solely devoted to Khomeini, right? They stand separate from the regular Iranian army. They're made up largely of unemployed young men from the urban centers who are devoted to Khomeini. And this becomes a basis for Khomeini to intimidate and threaten any kind of organization or structure that is not on board with what he wants to do. He also organizes revolutionary tribunals beginning in February of 1979, which are staffed by religious judges, and basically they're going to put on trial anyone associated with the Shah's government, right? You're going to see large numbers of Iranians flee the country. I mean, anyone who had been doing relatively well under the Shah is not going to stick around. So, for instance, large numbers of Iranians that you find in the United States originally descended from those individuals who had left the country at the time of the revolution. And one final organization that Khomeini is going to create, and this is really about generating popular support for himself and what he wants to see come to pass, is going to be the Islamic Republic Party, right, which seeks to mobilize popular support for an Islamic Republic and at the same time discredit any secular moderates. It also has authority over the Revolutionary Guards, which it can basically call upon to break up any opposition rallies, anyone who doesn't agree with where Khomeini is taking the country. And this Islamic Republic Party, much different from the Resurgence Party that had been initiated by the Shah many years earlier, actually enjoys tremendous support among the masses, particularly the rural masses, and most members of the ulama. And, again, for most Iranians at this point, And it's not strictly a matter of being religious, but Shiism is a very important part of their identity as Iranians, right? So many are attracted to the promise of Islamic social justice, right? I mean, they're using the language of Shiism in order to address these kind of grievances that many people have related to their economic situation, their social situation, and so forth. And so the Islamic Republic Party is going to be very effective at drawing support. On the other side, you do have some secular moderates, and they end up being represented primarily by the freedom movement, but they don't really enjoy that much support outside this kind of small middle class of professionals and technocrats, right? People, maybe some Western educated students, and a small element among the bazaar merchants, right? But the vast majority of people in Iran really don't understand what the freedom movement represents. They're much more attracted to the Islamic Republic Party. And what is it that Khomeini wants? He wants to create a new kind of government that represents almost a hybrid of democracy and Islam, right? And so he's going to put it to a referendum. They hold a referendum, a kind of nationwide vote in March 1979, and it shows clear, almost unanimous support for an Islamic republic as advocated by Khomeini. So, what does that actually mean in practice? Under the proposed constitution, legislative authority would be vested in a legislative body, an assembly, or the term they use is majlis, one consisting of popularly elected individuals, right? So this is, how democracy works. You'll have a legislative body made up of people who have been properly elected. You'll have competing parties, a number of different people competing for each seat. So in this regard, it really is a proper democracy. But overseeing the Majlis will be something called the Council of Guardians, made up of 12 appointed members of the ulama, including the Ayatollah. And so basically, the responsibility of the Council of Guardians is to vet out anything that the Majlis might propose and to ensure that it is in accord with Islamic standards, right? So, as stated in the slide, all laws and regulations approved by the Majlis were to be vetted by the Council of Guardians to make sure they were in accordance with Islamic standards. Sorry for any typos there. So all of this was going to be based on the principles of Islamic government that the Ayatollah had outlined back in 1971 in his Vilayat-e-Fiqh Hukumat-e-Islami, right? The idea that governance must be entrusted to Islamic jurists or members of the ulama, who in theory are acting on behalf of the hidden imam, as per Shia Twelver theology, right? You might remember the vast majority of Shiites in Iran are Twelvers. And so they believe that the 12th Imam is in a state of hiding to return, state of occultation to return at the end days. In the meantime, the jurists operate on his behalf. And at the top of that structure is going to be Khomeini himself, who is entrusted with the position of supreme jurist, the most powerful position in the governmental structure, and the leader of people in the absence of the 12th hidden Imam. And he has extensive powers. I mean, first of all, he has the right to appoint half the members of the Council of Guardians, meaning that he controls the majority of that body, 6 plus himself, meaning 7 out of 12. He is also the commander of the armed forces and of the Revolutionary Guards. So the Islamic Republic of Iran, I want to be clear, the Majlis, this kind of democratically elected body, does legislate. They are the ones who create the laws. But the Council of Guardians vets them out, decides, has basically the right to veto if it feels that something they've come up with is not in accordance with Islamic values. And this is perhaps more important, they have the right to interpret the laws, to decide how to actually implement them, right? So that gives them a lot of power. The idea being that only those who have mastered Islamic jurisprudence are qualified to administer the laws. Well, I should note that another very important governmental position will be that of president, which is also determined through elections. It's not clear what the exact powers are of the president at first. It is pretty clear that it's not going to be anyone of whom Khomeini doesn't approve. The first president, though not a cleric, is a close associate of his, Abul Hassan Bani Sadr. What's kind of interesting is he actually favored secular government, right? So there's still something kind of fluid about the way in which this new government is developing. He did support the Islamic basis of Iranian identity, that Shiism should be a very important part of the way forward in Iran. But he did try also to curb the influence of the ulama and rein in the Revolutionary Guards. And this eventually puts him at odds with Khomeini. And once he loses his confidence, he basically ends up having to step down. He's basically impeached in 1981. In the meantime, a situation develops that's going to, in some ways, define the early days of the Iranian Revolution, certainly from the perspective of the United States. The Iranian hostage crisis, which is a diplomatic crisis that's going to last from November of 1979 all the way until January of 1981. So what happened? When the Shah left Iran, he was granted asylum in the United States, partly out of sympathy, but also a sense of obligation, given that the United States had pretty much propped him up for decades, right? Sympathy because he was dying from cancer. But Iranians were outraged by this. And from their point of view, this just kind of confirmed this kind of unholy relationship that had existed between the United States and the Shah for decades, right? This is where you start seeing the United States kind of designated as the great Satan, right? And in fairness, there was some basis for this, that we had helped orchestrate this coup against Mohammad Mossadegh. We had helped the Shah create this secret service, the Savak. By the time of the revolution, you had something like 100,000 Americans residing in Tehran, mostly as advisors to the Iranian government, but very often living in the best parts of the city, in the best apartment buildings, very often kind of, walking around like they own the place. So a lot of resentment about the United States. And this became kind of the catalyst that just kind of set off people. So what happened? Members of a militant student group stormed the American embassy in Tehran and took 63 diplomats hostage, and they would remain hostage for 444 days, right? And very often Ayatollah Khomeini is like, well, there's nothing I can do about it. They're really upset. Eventually, they were finally released, but this became, for many Americans, kind of a defining event of, their understanding of Iran. Many of them hadn't really paid much attention to what had been happening until then. From their point of view, it's like couldn't understand why this had happened. But it really created a lot of bad blood. In the meantime, the Ayatollah Khomeini is going to consolidate his control further, believe it or not, right? So he took care of the kind of more secular-minded opposition, but there are people even further, I can't say further to the left, but more radical in terms of, what should be the role of Islam in the government than him. Probably most important in this regard were the Mujahideen Khalq, which preached a combination of Marxism and Islamism and argued that God not only created the world, and this is the Marxist part, but had set forth a historical evolution in which eventually a classless society would supplant capitalist iniquity and inequality and injustice and so forth. Right, so a very kind of interesting fusion of Marxist thought with Islamic Shiite tradition. This is a very radical reinterpretation of Islam, and it ends up being strongly opposed by the traditional conservative clergy, which in particular resented their argument that the Shia ulama had failed to grasp the real essence of Quranic dynamism. Right, so it's kind of feeling that these upstarts think they understand the Quran better than us. Who are they? So religion ends up being also reinterpreted to justify terrorism. The Mujahideen Khalq will engage in terrorist acts against the new Iranian government. But they argued that this was completely consistent with this kind of traditional Shia glorification of martyrdom, right? The willingness, that we should have been willing to die alongside of Hussein back during the Battle of Karbala to stand up against tyranny. Eventually, the Mujahideen Khalq are suppressed, and this new Islamic republic in Iran will take root and is still with us today. But almost immediately after this threat is dealt with, a new one emerges. And that will be a 8-year war with neighboring Iraq, the Iran-Iraq War. And this will really prove to be a major challenge to the new regime, but also providing a basis for unity, right? Like kind of, rally around the flag effect as the country goes to war with the neighboring state. And we'll stop there. We're going to have one more lecture regarding developments in Iraq, inclusive of the Iran-Iraq War, and then that will be pretty much the end of what we're going to discuss in this matter.